Good evening. My name is John Markham, and as president of the Faculty Emeriti Association, I welcome you through the wet that we've all wanted and desired but don't enjoy that much. We have before us here, for the second of our Emeriti lectures of the year, we do 2 every year, a very wondrous and contradictory person. Students across the country are reading his history of the Soviet Union from the beginning to the end. But it's a little hard to imagine him as a law student scrambling across the border from his native Hungary and across the Atlantic to join the Ivy League of the US and onward to Santa Cruz, where he was a founding member of the faculty at Stevenson. He reads the National Review every day, but he has a very liberal, humanist view of the world. He is leaving in a few days for Hungary to write a sequel to the first book of history of Hungary, The Days of Gloom, the communist height of the communist period. And yet I saw him in Hungary joyously introducing UC students to the history and culture of his native country. In order to understand these contradictions, I'm turning to the distinguished professor of English and comparative literature, Murray Baumgarten, who for the last 2 decades has been teaching with our speaker of the Holocaust. I should have noted that he's been giving this course on Hitler and Stalin, and yet imagines the good side of humanity. And I am asking Murray to give us some insight and to introduce him, this wondrously kind and gentle scholar who eliminates the evil that can be man. Murray.
Stevenson College brought Peter and myself together. He and I were founding members, started our teaching in 1966 with the college core courses. I taught in the fall. Peter lectured in the winter on continuity and change in the Soviet Union, and colleagues ran sections. 20 years later, in January 1985, our colleague David Kahn, then provost of the college, organized a conference commemorating the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet Red Army, with the participation of Leopold Poldek Pfefferberg Page, whom you will remember from Schindler's List. Poldek earlier had persuaded Thomas Keneally to write the book, and later suggested to Steven Spielberg he do the movie that was to win the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1993. Keneally had stopped in Pfefferberg Page's Rodeo Drive luggage store because he needed a briefcase. David Kahn stopped in to get his fixed. Keneally walked out with materials for the book, called Schindler's Ark in its first British publication, that would win the Booker Prize in 1982. David left Poldek's store with the impetus for a gathering that would parallel the Day of Liberation, January 27th every year, when Europeans everywhere commemorate the liberation of the Jews from the Nazi concentration and death camps. It was the idea that would lead to the first Santa Cruz Conference on the Holocaust, and the course Peter and I have been teaching ever since then. In the course, Peter and I alternate lectures. He elaborates the historical trajectory country by country. I talk in some detail about the literary works, from diaries to memoirs to fiction. We show the major films. The students attend sections where they discuss the material with the help of section leaders. Guest speakers play important roles, including survivors, other historians, former students, now distinguished scholars of aspects of the Holocaust, like James Young. It's wonderful to teach with Peter. Students stop us and tell us it's a unique experience. But sharing the podium with Peter? Well, to paraphrase the greatest writer in English, whom Peter incidentally doesn't like as much as Dostoevsky, teaching with Peter is the best of times, the worst of times. While Peter and I agree about many things, we also disagree, among other things, about the status of stories and historical facts that emerge from historical narratives, as well as what we can call resistance during the Holocaust. And we argue and discuss and disagree about these issues in the class. That's important, that's fun. But he can always upstage me, and almost anyone else besides. When I have the microphone, Peter can barely wait his turn. And he's so witty and persuasive. And well, I think of him as a magician. With a turn of phrase, he reveals a new side of the situation. He reminds us, for example, that though we may want to praise those who stood against the Nazis, we cannot therefore forget or demean those who were killed just because they were Jews. For as he puts it so effectively, as an agnostic, as a man of the people, and even though he is not a man of faith, he is always telling me we are all in God's hands. Peter is a man of paradoxes. He claims he's a man of few words because he comes from a poor country, but he's managed to write 10 books already, and there's a new one on the way. He has a talent for friendship. The gracious and generous hospitality of Peter and his wife, Penny, brings people from all over the world to Santa Cruz. And he has so many admirers and friends, they've established a Facebook fan page for him, filled with enough comments of his to fill a book we might call Quotations from Chairman Kenez. But he's already done that, and it's called Varieties of Fear, and is his autobiographical account of growing up in Hungary under Nazism and Stalinism. As a colleague once said of Peter, apparently this poor Eastern European country he's from is rich in amazing personal histories, Peter's especially among them. Like John Markham, besides his autobiography, I recommend Peter's 1999 study, A History of the Soviet Union from the Beginning to the End. But I also want to comment on the thoughtfulness his research extends not only to his own work, but to the generosity with which he treats his colleagues. What a pleasure to work with him, to be encouraged by him, till Bruce Thompson and Peter and I had pulled together the essays that became the 2009 anthology, Varieties of Anti-Semitism, History, Ideology, Discourse. And by now you figured out he likes the idea of varieties. He's a historian who sees many different kinds of things in the world. He's almost a novelist. Growing out of a conference we held in Santa Cruz several years before, our Varieties collection has become a paradigm for conferences and much scholarly work on the subject since. Here, too, his research and teaching have come together. Our course, The Holocaust, the Destruction of European Jewry, began as an upper division offering for the Modern Society and Social Thought program, an interdisciplinary major offered by Stevenson College. When that major was closed, Peter and I continued to offer the course now as 2 courses, one in history, one in literature, 2 courses that meet at the same time and the same place. It continues to be filled with students and friends who come to listen and learn. From the beginning, the course was enriched by external grant funds, first through Poldek's help from the 1939 club centered in Los Angeles that later funded a chair in Holocaust Studies at UCLA, and then with the support of Ann Neufeld-Levin. Ann and her husband Paul grew up in Michigan, where they had both gone to school, met each other, and married. Anne and her family had left Nazi Vienna in 1939. They came to Santa Cruz in 1964 as a married couple and immediately became staunch supporters of our newly established university. In 1991, Anne endowed the Stevenson College Lecture in Holocaust Studies, and then in 1995, in honor of her parents, whom some of us may remember knowing, she endowed the Neufeld Levin Chair, in her words, quote, as an interdisciplinary endowed chair to support teaching, research, and public service related to the Holocaust, including its circumstances and continuing implications. And Peter and I have shared this chair for the last 15 years. Anne later donated the Neufeld Levin archives to special collections at McHenry Library, which now contains the papers, memorabilia, stamps, medals, artifacts, photos of a remarkable family history of 3 generations of Austrian and Viennese Jews. Over the years, 7 other individuals have also contributed to the Neufeld Levin Endowed Chair Fund, which continues to fulfill the mission Anne envisioned when she established it with then-Chancellor Karl Piester. In establishing the chair, Anne stated, quote, I feel compelled to keep alive my legacy from the Holocaust surrounding World War II. My parents and I were on a train March 13, 1939, emigrating from Vienna, Austria to the United States at the exact same moment Hitler's troops invaded Czechoslovakia. A miracle separated my escaping alive from the eventual annihilation of my grandparents, aunts, and 6 million other Jews. As a result, I believe it is critical to perpetually study the circumstances culminating in Hitler's final solution for Jews. Only by remembering can we honor the victims and help prevent a similar onslaught against any group. In his autobiography, Peter briefly recounts his own story of survival, in counterpoint to those members of his family, like his father, who were not so lucky. Personal history has come together with the historian's work for Peter. For him, teaching and research have enriched each other. It is what the colleges at Santa Cruz, what the interdisciplinary traditions of the campus have nourished, and we are all their beneficiaries. Like Anne Neufeld Levin, Poldek Pfefferberg must have been convinced when he came to Santa Cruz for that conference that started all this, that, quote, public education is the most critical problem-solving tool we have in California. Peter's lectures and his forthcoming book on the Holocaust, parts of which he will present this evening, provide a remarkable perspective on events, actions, and human behavior we all continue to need to learn from. Please join me in welcoming and honoring Professor Emeritus of History, my buddy, Peter Kenez.
Murray, I hope that you will keep this little introduction because it can be very useful when you give my obituary. Thank you, John. Thank you, Murray. I am conscious of the honor of being able to give this talk, and for it, I think it was worthwhile to suffer the embarrassment which I was listening to. Well, you may be wondering, what can I say about the subject of the Holocaust, on which there is so much written. The library is so extensive. What can anyone say in an hour which you might find surprising? Well, I hope I can by phrasing the questions perhaps somewhat differently, and therefore arrive at comparisons, arrive at generalizations which you might find thought-provoking. Well, I think that the Holocaust is a German rather than a Jewish story. And by this, of course, I don't mean that this is not something, a terribly important part of Jewish self-understanding and demography and social history. What I mean by this is that who the Jews were is extremely important for our understanding the Holocaust. And indeed, I want to talk about this in some detail in a moment. But what I mean by this is that what needs an explanation is German rather than Jewish behavior. There is not much to be said about Jewish behavior during the Holocaust. Jews behaved like any other group would have behaved under the circumstances. And the great historian of the Holocaust, in my mind, still unsurpassed, Hilberg, says that Jewish passivity at the time of the Holocaust can be explained by the millennia of Jewish history. I don't think so. I think there is very good evidence that other groups also lost what is called, not very pretty, in social science, agency. That is, we have good evidence that other groups in similar circumstances behaved the same way. The Germans captured millions of Soviet prisoners of war, out of which they managed to kill 57%. And there is absolutely no evidence that this military-aged young man provided any resistance. There are circumstances where resistance is not possible. So what, on the other hand, does require an explanation, how could the Germans do it? I mean, how could it happen in our wonderful 20th century, in the center of civilized Europe? What were the preconditions? Because all sorts of things had to come together. It was not easy. And this is really what I want to talk about. It seems to me that there are three things which are necessary for our understanding. One, of course, is anti-Semitism, about which I will have more to say, what I have in mind. The other is a totalitarian state, which is taken over by a lunatic group. And third, the war. These things were all an absolutely essential part. Now, anti-Semitism, of course, is a precondition. It's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. Well, my outline will be that I want to talk about these three. Namely anti-Semitism, the totalitarian state. I'm not saying German state, I'm saying totalitarian state. And the war. Well, anti-Semitism. Of course, it has a millennia-old history, and this is really not open to doubt that without this it would not have worked. Except anti-Semitism is not really a satisfactory word. What I mean by this is that it describes so many things, the varieties. And we actually have to listen to different anti-Semites to understand what they are saying. Now, of course, anti-Semitism, as any prejudice, is not pretty. But when we talk about the anti-Semitism of the Ukrainian peasant, who regarded Jews as, wrongly of course, as their exploiters, that's one thing. When we hear about a British aristocrat who treat Jews with disdain, that's another thing. It's not the same. And then when we talk about Hitler, it's something else again. It's an altogether different matter. What is essential, it seems to me, when we talk about Nazi anti-Semitism, to understand what the Nazis had in mind, was, of course, they talked about Jews as worms and the lowest of the low. But the important thing was that they feared the Jews. Now, this is crazy. Nazism was crazy. But Jews seemed to be behind everything which they did not like. And this is the product of the modern age. This is the product of the 19th century. And it seems to me that we have to distinguish of the anti-Semitism of the pre-industrial age and the industrial age. And what I have in mind, and this is what I have to talk about in more detail, is that in the course of the 19th century, the Jews have done very well. And by I mean economically, making contributions to intellectual life. And that requires an explanation. That is the kind of anti-Semitism which was central to Nazi ideology. And I really think it was central to Nazi ideology. That was possible only at a time when the Jews could be depicted and understood as something very powerful and dangerous and behind everything which they don't like. Now, this is a delusion, but the delusion has how should I put it? A grain of truth in it, in as much as the Jews, in fact, became powerful. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average Jewish income in Germany was 3.5 times greater than the non-Jewish income. And I'm not saying that what motivated Nazi anti-Semitism was jealousy. Jealousy is perhaps a part of it, but that's not the crucial part. The crucial part was fear of Jewish power. And this is the great paradox, or maybe not paradox, the great irony of Jewish history from 1800 to 1950, is that the great tragedy of the Holocaust coincided with the great accomplishments of the Jewry, which before 1800 was not so remarkable. And as it seems to me, we are on the downhill as far as our significance in world culture and economy is concerned. Now, it seems to me that these, namely Jewish accomplishments on the one hand and the Holocaust on the other, are just two sides of the same coin. This is not an accident that the two went hand in hand. So one must explain how come the Jews became so significant in the course of the 19th century. What happened? Well, the coming of the industrial age. And this is very important inasmuch as in the mind of the anti-Semite, the Jews came to be associated with the modern industrial world. Now, the Jews did not create the modern industrial world. They did not create modernity. The Jews were in a position to take advantage of the opportunities which the industrial age offered. That is, they brought something with themselves from their pre-industrial past, which suddenly, in the new circumstances, became very relevant and enabled them to do well. This is perhaps an unappreciated phenomenon of the great transformation in the course of the 19th century, first in Western European, then Eastern European Jewish world, and how it happened. Well, what we are talking about, and we associate the beginning of this modern world with the French Revolution, and then, of course, this is an oversimplification. But nonetheless, I think it is as good a starting point as any, inasmuch as the French are always the most articulate, explaining what was going on, and in this sense, it is possible, it is worthwhile to talk about the French who articulated the issues. And of course, the issues were of breaking down of a civilization, a society based on estates, where the individual mattered, where the notion of the state was reconceptualized. And therefore, for the first time, it became an issue, do the Jews belong? Because up to that point, the Jews had their place in a society where everybody's place was predefined. Now, the consequences of that was a terrific transformation, industrial growth, and general improvement of well-being. However, this was not perceived as such. That is, much was lost. What was lost is the sense of belonging, the sense of community. And it seems to me that an anti-Semite is ipso facto against our modern world. And by contrast, on the other hand, that is, in the Nazi mind, not only the Nazi mind, I mean, this is really all around us, the Jews can be associated with everything which we don't like in the modern world. That is, this association of Jews and modernity, it seems to me, is a central point which I would like to stress. All right, so the question then, pushing it one step back, what enabled the Jews? What did they bring with themselves from the 18th century? Now, it's worthwhile to talk about this because these 4 points, which I will make, and of course one could make more, it's not merely an explanation of Jewish transformation and success, but also will become the tropes of anti-Semitic thought. Well, what I have in mind, and what enabled the Jews to do so well, transform themselves. One, I would say, the ability to read, the stress on education. A Jewish male performs his religious obligation by being able to read the Torah, the Talmud, which really is quite remarkable. A nearly universal Jewish male literacy before the coming of the Great Transformation. This is most unusual. I mean, think about it. It always seemed to me strange that a Jewish child of 13 shows his maturity by being able to interpret a passage. I mean, what a strange idea. I mean, surely there is no other group, as far as I know, which would want to demonstrate maturity by interpreting a passage. I mean, the idea that you call the place of worship the shul. I mean, so what happens at that time when these particular habits suddenly become valuable? That is, you read the Talmud, and Talmudic learning is not necessarily helpful in the modern world. But what is helpful in the modern world is to interpret a passage. You become a lawyer by reading the Talmud, because knowledge is transferable. British children in the British man in the olden days learned the classics and they went to administer provinces in India. Well, it's not directly relevant, but it is a good thing. So that is my first point. The second point is being excluded from agriculture. How wonderful that is. That is, the action is not in the village. If you have land, that ties you down. The action is in the cities. You are free to go. And in fact, what happened is the French Jewry, by the middle of the century, half of them lived in Paris. Not being a peasant is a good thing. Third, the question of usury. Well, as you know, Christians, Muslims were not supposed to give money on interest. By the way, Jews were also not supposed to give money on interest to other Jews. But that's not relevant. What is relevant is that kings, princes, rulers needed money, and there were the Jewish bankers, and arguably the Jews created modern financial administration. Now, to be sure, this really included a relatively small number of people, but nonetheless, that was a good thing, the ability to handle money. Fourth, prejudice, being persecuted. Now, this is not much of an advantage, you will say, but you depend on one another. That is, you invest with Madoff. Well, that particularly is a mistake. But the point is that you trust him just because he's Jewish. You have international connections. You have international connections. The first, globalizers. And you are a Hungarian Jew who, of course, can also speak German. You have relatives in wherever, and you want to establish your business. This is a great advantage. Now, you can turn this around, as the anti-Semites did. For them, the ability to interpret a passage was splitting hair. Talmudic learning is ipso facto something distasteful. Not being peasants, well, that means they want to avoid real hard work. True enough. Depending on one another, well, that means they are clannish. Again. Have international connections? Well, they are, to use the Stalinist phrase, they are ruthless cosmopolitans. And there is some truth in all of these in order to make it saleable. Now, my point is that this would not have worked before the Industrial Revolution. That is, the iconic text, the Protocols of the Ancients of Zion, could not have been written, could not have worked in the 18th century, would have been ridiculous. The notion of a Jewish world conspiracy in the 18th century would have been as ridiculous as today talk about the world conspiracy of the gypsies. I mean, it doesn't sell. I mean, no matter how silly you are, there are limits. But what is in the protocols that speaks to people? The Jews are behind it. Well, what happened in the course of the 19th century? First, emancipation. Emancipation meant emancipation. Emancipation meant doing away with laws which were applied only to Jews. The next step was acculturation. Emancipation, acculturation in the course of the 19th century took place everywhere in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe. Acculturation means that the particular Jewish dress, Jewish behavior would disappear, and walking in the street, people couldn't tell that you were a Jew. And therefore all the more dangerous, because you never know who is a Jew. Indeed, who is a Jew? This, in the course of the 19th century, became a difficult question, which the question could not have arisen in the 18th century. And then, ultimately, the third would be assimilation. Well, assimilation would mean the disappearance of Jewish identity. And the remarkable thing is that this was behind, in Western Europe, the notion of emancipation. That is the idea that once you do away laws which restrict Jewish behavior, Jews would become like everybody else, and Jews, maybe go to a different church, but nonetheless, they would be like any other Frenchman or any other Saxon or Dutchman or what have you. The funny thing is that this did not happen. It did not happen, or it happened to a very small extent. In Germany, perhaps above all, in France to some extent. It did not happen because Jews who did not go to the synagogue, Jews who actually lost their faith, nonetheless somehow continued to think of themselves as Jews. And of course everybody else continued to think of them as Jews. Why? I mean, where did their identity reside? I mean, what made them Jewish if they did not go to the synagogue? I don't know. I mustn't go into this too much, the psychological aspect. So, but what I do want to say is that a new kind of anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism of fear, is central to Nazi ideology, and they took this very seriously. It really borders on absolute madness that in 1944, the Nazi leaders talking to one another, that is not propaganda, but talking to one another and describing that Jews are our most dangerous enemies at a time when the Jews were dead. Well, the lunacy is what makes the study of the Holocaust so worthwhile and interesting, if you are a connoisseur of lunacy. Well, we come to the second point. The Germans, the Nazis, the German state. And what I want to emphasize, that what was crucial here is not that they were Germans. It mattered to some extent. The Germans brought with themselves an ability to organize, which proved, I don't want to say useful, but impressive nonetheless. The question is how important anti-Semitism was in Hitler's coming to power. There's really no convincing evidence that Germans in the beginning of the 20th century were more anti-Semitic than other people of Western Europe, to say nothing about Eastern Europe. Poles, Romanians, yes, that's real anti-Semitism. The Germans, well, how are we to measure? Several historians made the point that if in 1900 you foresaw what was to happen, would you have suspected the French or the Germans? And they would have chosen the French. Well, French anti-Semitic thought was every bit as advanced, if I may put it this way, as German anti-Semitic thought. So what happened? How important it was. Surely the Germans did not vote for the Nazis because they wanted to bring Auschwitz about. Because after all, they couldn't have, because the Nazis themselves didn't know about Auschwitz. The Nazis, for a long time, didn't know what to do with the Jews. Now, those who voted for the Nazis, and as you know, the last free election in the fall of 1932, the Nazis got something like 37% of the vote, which means that 37% were willing to vote for a party which had in its flank the most unattractive idea about Jews, which was certainly well known. So, but how many people voted for the Nazis because of their anti-Semitism? It's impossible to give figures or make reliable points. But my sense is that as many people voted for the Nazis because of their anti-Semitism as many people who voted against the Nazis because of their anti-Semitism. But for the vast variety of the Germans, the Jews were not terribly important. Now, once you establish a totalitarian state, we have an entirely new world with entirely new issues which we are dealing with. What we have evidence is that the Germans actually became more anti-Semitic as time went on. That is, they were more anti-Semitic in 1938 than they were in 1933. And they were more anti-Semitic in 1944 than they were in 1938. The explanation, I think, is multifaceted, but most significantly, it seems to me, is that the Nazi state, to put it mildly, mistreated their Jewish minority. And the genius of a totalitarian state is to reduce everyone, or almost everyone, to become an accomplice. And consequently, people had to believe that the Jews were evil in order to justify themselves for what they were doing. And it seems to me that anti-Semitism then, and German behavior then, is a descending spiral. The more they mistreated the Jews, the more they killed, the more they viciously killed, the more they hated the Jews. That's one factor. Another factor is that they took Jewish property. And you had to justify themselves by saying that, well, they deserved it. So they hated the Jews more and more. But in a totalitarian state, what is one to do? Let us say you are a decent human being, and you are shocked by what is being done to your fellow human beings. What are you to do? First of all, you must worry that I must be crazy, because everybody around me tells me that the Jews are our most dangerous enemy, and they are like vermin, they are like rats. How can I think differently? But even if you have the strength to say, yes, I do think differently. Yes, I think what is going on here is evil. What am I going to do? To whom will I tell? A totalitarian state is a totalitarian state because it allows the articulation of only one point of view. A totalitarian state does not exist without concentration camps. So, if you are a courageous person, and you have the strength, and you speak up, you will be hit over the head. And then you tell yourself, what for? What can I do? Well, of course, there are parallels. I mean, who spoke up in the Soviet Union against what was happening to various national minorities or the gulags? Nobody. This is a totalitarian state. It can prevent decency. It can prevent acting and behaving like human beings. So here we are now in the 1930s. The Nazis took power. They established the kind of state which Hitler wanted to establish very quickly, really in a matter of weeks. Germany became a different state. What shall we do with the Jews? This is really an overwhelming issue for the Nazi leadership. My point is that it's not so easy to come up with the solution with which they ultimately came up. Well, we're going to kill them. Several steps had to be taken. A lot had to happen before you reach that stage. So what shall we do with the Jews? Well, we will make their lives so miserable as they want to live. And indeed, they were very good at that. They certainly made people's life as miserable as that could be. And indeed, a substantial number of German Jews left, which has the ironic consequence that if you are a Jew in the middle of the 1930s, in Germany, you have a far better chance of survival than if you are a Jew somewhere in Eastern Europe, because they left, especially Austrian Jews. There it was so quick, it was so obvious what to do that in March 1938, when the Anschluss, when the Germans incorporated Austria, the behavior of the Austrians were so extraordinary that it really persuaded people. Now, in the course of the 1930s, various steps were taken, which were actually a precondition for the Holocaust. Now, the important thing, the interesting thing is that they were not taken in order to bring this result about. But in retrospect, we see that they were necessary. Of course, what I have in mind, one is definition, the so-called Nuremberg Laws. I mean, after all, if you want to persecute a group, you have to specify who belongs there, which is not easy. The Nazis spent a great deal of time agonizing over the issues of the half-blood, and they could never really resolve it to their own satisfaction. They went on having conference after conference of, well, we can perhaps sterilize them or maybe kill half of them. The second step, what was necessary, is to impoverish them. Well, that is, of course, the most attractive idea. The consequence of that the Jews came to be excluded from social life. The Jews lost their non-Jewish friends in business, in professions, and in personal life. And the Jews came to be concentrated. They came to depend on one another. Jews from the small towns moved into the major cities. Now, all this would be very important when it came to the extermination of the German Jewry, in the sense that it was much easier to pick them up because you knew who should be picked up, and because by that time you didn't have to bother German society, because the people who were actually picked up in 1941 you already didn't know them. This was not your Jewish friend, because you haven't seen your Jewish friend for years. It was not your Jewish doctor, because a Jewish doctor already couldn't treat you. It was not your Jewish schoolmate, because you didn't have Jewish schoolmates any longer. Now, in retrospect, this made the ultimate deportations in Germany possible and easier, because the Nazis were very concerned about not making an impact on German society. And when this was inevitable, they backed down. That is, in Germany, not in other parts of Europe, a man was married to a non-Jewish woman, or a woman was not married to a non-Jewish man, actually survived. Because otherwise, you would have to take him away, and then this would make an impression. And indeed, when they arrested Jewish men in Berlin, their Christian wives came to demonstrate, and they let them go. The price was too high of bothering with them. Well, I mean, obviously I could go on and on, because it's a big topic. Now, the third issue, without which it could not have happened, was the war. You cannot kill millions of people in peacetime. And we can directly correlate the extent, the brutality of the extermination with the progress of the war. And the war basically consisted of two parts. One is the not so serious war, 1939 to 1941, and the real war with the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. That is a real war. Now, the killing started immediately in September 1939. Killing actually not Jews. This is the euthanasia program. Killing the handicapped, killing the mentally deficient Germans. They could not do this at peacetime, but they immediately sensed it, that in the wartime this can be done. And they killed something like 70,000 people. Some of them were Jews, but mostly they were not Jews. Mostly they were various people. And of course, this did make an impact on German society. And there were Germans who protested. And the euthanasia program sort of died. I mean, sort of died. By this I mean that sub rosa, it was really continued. They kept on killing the handicapped. But as a program, it was stopped. This actually has great relevance to our Jewish story, inasmuch these very people then took over the larger task. Really, the same individuals who acquired experience in using gas for killing people then went on to the more ambitious tasks of killing now, well, millions. So the killing of Jews actually starts in 1939. And the form of killing is you put them into ghettos and you starve them. And people die. And we must remember that only half of the Jews who died during the Holocaust died in gas chambers. The other half died in ghettos, died because they were shot, died because they lived in conditions when diseases were inevitable. So people died in ghettos. It was part of the German plan. It was not something which they did not foresee. And yet, it seems to me, there is still a moral boundary of putting people in conditions where they are likely to die, or actually shooting them. And then came the real war, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and mass murder begins. But it seems to me the interesting thing is that the mass murder began before the decision was made to commit mass murder. That is, it was easier to kill than to make the decision to kill. The mass murder starts right away, in as much as so-called Einsatzgruppen enter the Soviet Union with the Wehrmacht, with the German army, and they come with the order of shooting commissars and partisans. And that, of course, meaning Jews, because Bolshevism is Jewish. We make no distinction between Bolsheviks and Jews. The Jews are behind keeping up this false entity, the Soviet Union. Within weeks, then arises the question, well, what shall we do with the women? What shall we do with the children? Well, we'll kill them too. The problem is that we need the food. We have to kill them. We have to kill them because if the children will grow up, they will take revenge on us. But of course, Nazi anti-Semitism is part of a larger racist ideology, which is way beyond our human concept and understanding. Namely, the notion is that Poland, which we are now going to incorporate, the western part of Poland, has about 8% German minority. We are going to eliminate the Polish upper class. By Polish upper class, they had in mind educated Poles, priests, lawyers, professors, and indeed they start to do this right in 1939. Actually, in the first month, they killed more non-Jewish Poles than Jews. And then the rest we are going to reduce to slavery. And they are going to work in this envisaged Germanic paradise where we are going to bring in settlers. Now, this is a lunatic vision. It's not only morally reprehensible, but it's crazy. It simply cannot be done. Well, talking about the war, the important thing is that Eastern Europe and Western Europe experience different Holocausts. We know more about the Western European part because Western Europeans are somewhat closer to us. There are more survivors. We have a much larger literature. The irony here is that the more lethal a place was, the less we know about it because people are not there to tell their stories. So we know about Auschwitz because people survived Auschwitz. We don't know about Treblinka because people did not survive Treblinka. They were delivered there in the morning and they were dead by the evening. But what I want to say is that, of course, the majority of the Jews lived in Eastern Europe. Second, the Germans could do things in Eastern Europe which they could not do in Western Europe. That is, it would have been unthinkable to take the Jews out in, let's say, Amsterdam, and take them out to the edge of the town and just massacre them. This can be done in the Ukraine. This cannot be done in Holland. So what the Eastern Europeans have experienced was something very different. And of course, it's not an accident that all the 6 extermination camps were in Eastern Europe, that is, in Poland. There were no extermination camps in Western Europe. There were concentration camps, and the death rate in many of them were quite high. But they were not extermination camps. They were all in the East. In fact, you picked up your Jews in Germany, in Holland, in Belgium, and you took them to East to kill them. I mean, why not kill them in situ? I mean, why bother? Well, because you just don't do such things in civilized Europe. You can do that in Poland. You can do it in the Ukraine. You cannot do it in France. Well, but the question is then, talking about the war, we can do kind of comparative counting. By comparative counting, I mean, it has always struck me as very interesting. Why is that over 3/4 of the Dutch Jews were exterminated, and only about 45% of the Belgian Jews, and about 30% of the French Jews? To what extent can we correlate pre-existing anti-Semitism with the success of extermination? And my point is not very much. It didn't work like that. That was not the determining factor. Surely nobody could argue that the Dutch were more anti-Semitic than the Belgians, or more anti-Semitic than the French. In fact, the other way. The Dutch were the only people in Europe who at one point went on strike, more or less, in defense of the Jews. Not quite, but more or less. And yet, so many Dutch Jews, such a large percentage of Dutch Jews died. So what was the determining factor? I think the determining factor was the nature of the occupying power. That is, Holland was under civilian leadership. The Nazi leaders came mostly from Austria, and they took this very seriously. They really cared. Belgium was under military occupation. Well, of course, the Wehrmacht was by no means French of the Jews. On the other hand, it was not uppermost in their mind. This was not the most important thing for them. And consequently, the situation was better in Belgium. And in France, now you know the French the situation is the most complex. And there was the Vichy regime, which really was a collaborationist regime. And their views, their ideas, and the kind of people who participated in it were as unattractive a bunch as you can imagine. But nonetheless, the Germans were forced to negotiate with them, as they did not negotiate in Holland. There was nobody to negotiate with Holland. And then, a few more minutes, and then we come to the Danes. Well, the Danish story, which is really so uplifting. It's the Danes who were really so nice. However, that's not what mattered. The Danes were indeed very nice. I mean, you know what happened. The Jews were put on small boat. 6,500 Jews who were in Denmark were taken over to Sweden, and then they survived. And their Danish friends and relatives were really very nice. They, on occasion, they actually contributed to the cost of the gasoline. And when the Jews in 1945, they returned from Sweden, in some instances they found that their pets had been fed and the plants were watered. The Danes were very nice. However, that's not where the dead dog lies buried, as we say it in Hungarian. What mattered in Denmark are the kind of Germans who were there. And these Germans, I'm talking about a handful of people, 4 or 5 people, who infected one another with decency. The outstanding figure is a man whose name perhaps is not as well known as it should be, Ferdinand Duckwitz, who lived in Denmark before. By the way, he was a Nazi. He joined the party in 1932. That is, it wasn't necessarily a career move. Who just thought that this is not nice. And he took it on himself to go to Sweden and talk to the Swedish Prime Minister to accept the Jews. The head of the German Navy in Copenhagen Harbor when this great rescue affair was taking place. I mean, it's not that the Germans didn't know it. I mean, they're not fools. He said, and I'm sorry, all my small boats now are under repair. That is, they became traitors. They went against the clearly established, clearly announced desire of their governments. It was possible in Denmark. This would not have been possible in the Ukraine. To the extent that the German leaders infected one another, they did not infect one another with decency. They infected one another with the opposite of decency. But looking back at it, I think it is wrong to give out grades to the behavior of various groups and people, because circumstances were so different. It was easier to be a decent Dane than to be a decent Pole. The consequences were different. The Germans, for example, in Copenhagen, they came into possession of the list of Jews, all 6,500 of them, and they wanted to pick them up. And Werner Best, who was the German plenipotentiary in Copenhagen, the Danes would not cooperate. They would not give their police to help. So the Germans had to do the picking up by themselves. And Werner Best said to his inferiors, you may knock on the door, and if they open the door, you can arrest them, but you may not break down the door. So about 500 people were arrested and taken to Theresienstadt, as you know, was the primary, how should I say, the privileged camp, where the Danes continued to support them through the Red Cross, and actually only something like 50 of them died. Well, see, we're the nice people. Well, what we can say with assurance is that everywhere where the Germans went, they found collaborators. There was a Danish Nazi party, on the one hand. On the other hand, wherever the Germans did not go, the Jews survived, with the one great exception, Romania, and it always seemed to me that the Romanian Holocaust story is a separate story. The Romanians had their own Holocaust story, which was parallel with the German Holocaust. But Hungary, anti-Semitism was a powerful current. And before the Germans came in March 19th, 1944, and Hungary, while an ally, came under German occupation, then the deportation and the killing of the third largest Jewish community proceeded in quick order. But the Hungarians wouldn't have done it by themselves. Now, we talk about how nice the Bulgarians were. Well, of course, Bulgaria was not occupied by Germany, as Hungary was. Another generalization which we can make is that in every country where the Germans could negotiate with an authority which was inexistent, that authority would always give up their so-called foreign Jews first, rather than their native Jews. So in France, for example, the chances of survival of a French Jew was really very great, but those who had sought refuge in the previous decades, their survival rate was not good at all. Well, what are we left with? Well, historians are not here to give out grades. What we want is to approach an understanding, is to contemplate and to look at it for, I don't know for what reason. Well, that is what I wanted to say.